Egypt is a land of ghosts, but not the ones you might expect. The Egypt of the pyramids, the Egypt of the Bible and the ancient pharaohs, was effectively erased long before the Crusaders ever set foot on its burning sands. By the 7th century, a relentless tide from the Arabian Peninsula had surged across the North African coast, luring the Old World into a new identity. The original Egyptians became strangers on their own soil, subjects to an Arabiized culture that transformed the very DNA of the region. This was the landscape of the Fifth Crusade, a clash not just of swords, but of a world that was being reshaped by religious fervor and political desperation. The stakes were nothing less than the soul of the Mediterranean, and the risk was an all-consuming fire that threatened to burn away 200 years of history. To understand the darkness of this era, you must understand the transition of power. For 2 centuries, the world was a battlefield between Christianity and Islam, a period that defined modern borders and ancient hatreds. But by the time the Fifth Crusade was summoned, the focus had shifted. This wasn't just about a city of stone, it was about the strategic jugular of the East. The papacy, led by the formidable Pope Innocent III and his successors, realized that Jerusalem could never be held as long as Egypt stood as its protector. Egypt was the treasure chest, the granary, and the military backbone of the Ayyubid Sultanate. If Egypt fell, Jerusalem would be a fruit ripe for the picking. This was the grand design, a mission of absolute necessity, meant to rectify the shameful failures of the Fourth Crusade, which had seen Christians slaughtering fellow Christians in Constantinople. The Fifth Crusade was supposed to be the clean crusade, the one that restored the honor of the cross. The Pope recruited the elite, the blue bloods of Europe. Among them was King Andrew II of Hungary, a man whose kingdom was a rising star in the east, yet unknown to many in the west. Andrew arrived not out of pure devotion, but for the prestige to put Hungary on the map. He led a massive, well-equipped force, but his heart was never in the mud and blood of the Nile. He was a man of the Selfie era, born 8 centuries too early. He came, he saw the Holy Land from a distance, he collected his relics, and then he used a domestic crisis back home as an excuse to flee the coming storm. His departure left a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the darkest forces of the expedition. While kings and counts bickered, a new brotherhood was rising in the shadows of the older orders, the Teutonic Knights. Younger than the Templars and the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights were a German-based order that had begun as a humble medical mission during the Siege of Acre. By the Fifth Crusade, they had evolved into a steel-clad machine of war. These were men who had sworn oaths of poverty and obedience, but whose true devotion was to the cold efficiency of the blade. They were the elite of the elite, yet they watched with growing disdain as the leadership of the crusade began to fracture. They saw the incompetence of the nobles and the dangerous arrogance of the clergy, and they began to realize that their destiny might not lie in the heat of the desert, but in the frozen forests of the north. The primary objective was Damietta, a fortress city sitting like a lock on the mouth of the Nile. It was the gatekeeper of Egypt. If the Crusaders could break Damietta, the road to Cairo would be open. But Damietta was a nightmare of stone and water. For 18 long, agonizing months, the Crusaders besieged the city. It was a war of attrition that pushed both sides to the brink of insanity. The Crusaders used massive siege engines, stone hurlers that could shatter walls, and a psychological weapon that was perhaps more effective than any catapult: music. For a year and a half, the air was filled with the rhythmic thumping of drums, the blaring of trumpets, and the chanting of thousands of men, a constant, low-frequency terror that prevented the defenders from ever finding a moment of peace. Inside the walls, the Egyptians held on with a grim, desperate faith. They were led by Al-Kamil, the nephew of the legendary Saladin. Al-Kamil was a different kind of leader than his uncle. He was a pragmatist. He saw the suffering of his people and the strength of the Crusader steel, and he made an offer that should have ended the war then and there. He offered to trade Jerusalem, the holy city itself, along with most of Palestine, in exchange for the Crusaders leaving Egypt. It was everything the Christians had fought for over the last century. The military leaders, the men who actually bled in the trenches, were ready to take the deal. They knew the cost of war. They knew that a bird in the hand was worth more than a kingdom in the mud. But the crusade was no longer being led by soldiers. It was being led by Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate. Pelagius was a man of unyielding, blinded zealotry. He believed that he didn't need to negotiate with infidels because God was on his side. He argued that if God had given them the gates of Damietta, God would give them all of Egypt. He envisioned a world where the crescent was entirely erased, where the Nile ran red with the blood of the conquered, and where every soul in North Africa bowed to Rome. He rejected the Sultan's peace offer, not once, but twice. It was a moment of supreme hubris, a fatal turning point where religious obsession overrode military reality. The siege eventually broke through. Damietta fell, but it was a city of the dead. Famine and disease had done more work than the Crusaders' swords. The streets were choked with corpses, and the stench was a physical weight. Yet, Pelagius saw this as a divine victory. He pushed the army forward, deeper into the delta, toward Cairo. The soldiers were weary, their armor was heavy, and the Egyptian sun was a relentless executioner. They marched along the banks of the Nile, unaware that they were walking into a trap set by the river itself. They were foreigners in a land they did not understand, led by a priest who mistook his own ambition for the voice of God. The Egyptian delta is a labyrinth of canals and lowlands, and the Nile is a living god with its own schedule. As the Crusaders moved toward the city of Mansoura, the Sultan's forces played a waiting game. They didn't need to fight a pitched battle against the heavy cavalry of Europe. They only needed to wait for the season to turn. Al-Kamil knew what the Crusaders did not: the Nile was about to rise. While Pelagius was busy holding prayer sessions and claiming future glory, the Egyptians were quietly moving upriver, preparing to open the sluice gates and dikes that had controlled the river for millennia. The disaster struck with a terrifying, silent speed. One night, the Crusader camp was on dry ground, the next, the water was at their knees. The Nile had been unleashed. The heavy armor that made the Crusaders invincible on the battlefield now became their coffins. Horses panicked in the rising muck, and the supply lines were severed by the sudden emergence of new lakes and rushing torrents. The army was paralyzed, trapped in a sea of mud, surrounded by an enemy that moved effortlessly in small boats, picking off the stranded knights like fish in a barrel. The invincible army of Christ was reduced to a huddled mass of shivering, starving men, praying for a miracle that would not come. Cardinal Pelagius, the man who had promised total victory, was forced to beg for the very life of his army. The Sultan, showing a mercy his opponents had lacked, did not slaughter them. Instead, he forced a humiliating surrender. The Crusaders had to give back Damietta, leave Egypt entirely, and sign an 8-year truce. They returned to Europe with nothing: no Jerusalem, no Egypt, and no honor. They had held the keys to the holy city in their hands and threw them away for the sake of a fanatic's pride. The failure was so absolute that it shook the very foundations of faith in the West. People began to ask the most dangerous question of all: if this was a holy war, why did God choose the river to destroy his own army? The aftermath of the Fifth Crusade saw a profound shift in the knightly orders. The Teutonic Knights, witnessing the chaotic incompetence of the Mediterranean campaigns, effectively washed their hands of the Levant. They realized that fighting for the papacy in the desert was a fool's errand. They took their discipline, their steel, and their cross and moved to the Baltic frontiers. There, they would carve out their own empire, converting the pagan tribes of the north by the sword, creating the foundation for what would eventually become Prussia. Their exit was a silent indictment of the Crusades' leadership, a recognition that the dream of a Christian East was dying, suffocated by the very people who claimed to be its protectors. For the Muslim world, the victory at the Nile was a reaffirmation of their divine protection. They saw the flood not as a natural event, but as the hand of Allah interceding when the sword was not enough. It hardened their resolve and unified the Ayyubid territories under Al-Kamil's prestige. The Egyptians learned that the Crusaders were not invincible, that their heavy armor was a weakness, and that their religious zeal could be used against them. The psychological advantage shifted, setting the stage for the eventual total expulsion of the Crusader states from the coast of Palestine. The Fifth Crusade remains one of history's most haunting what-ifs. If the peace treaty had been signed, if Jerusalem had been restored to the Christians in 1219, the history of the Middle East might have been unrecognizable. There might have been a lasting coexistence, or at least a different balance of power that could have averted centuries of further bloodshed. Instead, the crusade ended in the mud of the Nile, a dark thriller of hubris and heartbreak. It serves as a grim reminder that when the politics of religion ignore the realities of the earth and its rivers will always have the final word. The ghosts of Egypt remained undisturbed, and the cross drifted back to Europe, tarnished by the silt of a river that refused to be conquered.